Hello, and welcome to the Ohio Christian Counseling Ministries Talk Show. I am your host, Micha'el Pearson, and here we deal with God's people, His kingdom, and the manner in which we walk into that kingdom. Today's episode is going to be a bit of a help for people who are thinking about counseling, who have some fears and some dispositions towards counseling, who have maybe had bad experiences with counseling, or there's definitely a certain stigma in the African American community regarding counseling. And what I want to do with this episode is offer to the viewers a type of counseling that is not so much intrusive. It is very delicate, very soft. It is a very, very common practice, and is a very common approach to counseling. And actually, I would have to go so far as to say that the healing process and the developmental process based on this counseling, it can even be considered to be fun to a great degree. I want to talk to you guys about CBT, and I'll tell you what CBT is. CBT is cognitive behavioral therapy. You may have heard of it before. You may have never heard of it before, but it is a very, very low rate, not so intrusive approach to counseling and being able to decipher some of the things that may go on in a person's mindset in regards to some of the issues that they may be dealing with. So first off, let's deal with cognitive behavioral therapy. Let's deal with the first word in that phrase, which is cognitive, which is a process, which is basically your cognition. And I'll tell you what cognition is. Cognition is the mental action or process of acquiring knowledge and understanding through thought, experience, and the senses. This is basically how we think, right? How we process and perceive information. So this is so as not to let the word or the phrase or the acronym CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy become something that's too frightening. You know, sometimes big words are used to define some of the things that's done in psychotherapy and psychology and counseling. But cognition is just the process by which we think, a pattern that is developed based on how we think. Now, cognition, usually the way we think, the way we process information, is usually determined by our behavior. But there's a connecting link between what we think and our behavior, and that connecting link is what we feel. So the best way to remember CBT, or the process, or the counseling approach using CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, is to understand 3 steps: head, heart, action. Because that in and of itself is what cognitive behavioral therapy does. It is a therapy that is used to interrupt that cycle of thought, feeling, action. Because most of our life, every single one of us, every single one of our life is based on some form of cognitive behavior. And it is based on some form of CBT. So we have to keep that in mind, that cognitive behavioral therapy in and of itself is just a process. It is what we all do. But some of us have cognitions, and some of us have feelings, and be based on those feelings, some of us exhibit behaviors that could be deemed extremely unhealthy for our overall sake and purpose. So that is the point of today's episode, and that's what we're going to try to look at and get into here and kind of unwrap this so that we could remove some of the mystique involved with counseling, and maybe you'll find a way to become more moved and being able to seek out counseling with this approach. Let me say this to you. CBT is the easiest form of therapy to have. It takes the sting out of the idea of therapy. It's effective, and it allows you to heal on 3 different levels. And those 3 different levels is sort of what we just talked about. It allows you to heal what you think. It allows you to heal what you feel, which ultimately allows you to heal the manner in which you behave. Now, the question then becomes, well, putting all of that together, cognitive behavioral therapy. What is exactly? What is? I've defined cognition. Everybody knows what a feeling is, and everybody knows what behavior is. But when you put them all together, and we're talking about these three levels in which we can be healed on, the next question, of course, is, well, what exactly is CBT, and how does that work? Well, CBT is a type of therapy that aims to improve mental health through disrupting negative patterns, to bring about change in how you feel, which determines how you behave, which determines our choices, and the way that we execute on those choices in everyday life. This, like I said, this is just part of the human condition. This is how we operate. Also, it can be used to effectively develop coping strategies that target problem solving. So there's sort of a double whammy here, where cognitive behavioral therapy can assist you in helping you improve certain areas of your life, your coping skills, and the choices, ultimately the choices that you made. So what are the uses? Let's talk about what are some of the uses of cognitive behavioral therapy. Usually CBT can challenge such thoughts that lead to depression and anxiety. Primarily, that is the use of CBT, because once we get into a pattern or a cycle dealing with either anxiety or dealing with depression, both of those are the realization in the mind of an overwhelming process or train of thoughts that bring about a certain feeling, and it causes us to behave a certain way, whether that's being withdrawn, whether that's being nervous, whether that's being using substances to diminish or to suppress certain feelings of depression or anxiety. That is primarily what it is used for. But it is also used for low self-esteem and a less than healthy self-view, because most of the time it is what we think about ourselves which determines how we feel about ourselves, which ultimately makes us behave, act, and do in a manner in which we may not make the best possible choices for our lives, for our day-to-day, for our, whether that's in love relationships, family relationships, whatever the case may be, on our jobs. If we're not feeling too good about ourselves, if we don't think much about ourselves, and we're not feeling too good about ourselves, then we're not going to probably make the best possible decisions in regards to taking steps for our own personal, mental, spiritual, and physical well-being. The third area where it can be used, CBT can be used, is basic problem solving in stressful relationships. That is a definite biggie, because as we become better at being able to balance and connect with what we feel, and understand that what we think determines what we feel, determines how we behave, then ultimately that helps us to deal with other stressful relationships, because for the most part, those stressful relationships are sort of cause and effect based on how we feel about ourselves when we're involved with those stressful relationships. Ultimately, the thing is, we're only in control of ourselves. We're only in control of what we think. We're only in control of what we feel. And therefore, we're only in control of what we do. So usually stressful relationships are based on the individual, namely ourselves, trying to obtain a certain position, trying not to lose a certain manner of control or leverage in either a relationship, argument, or position. That's what causes us stress. And because of that, we continue in this, I'll just call it a sort of a game of tug of war with stressful relationships, be that coworkers, be that friendships, or even be that family. We continue in these tug of wars when really the reality is, if we change the way we think about the thing, then it changes the way we feel about a thing. And what could be deemed as a loss in a stressful relationship is not necessarily a loss. It's only because we think it's a loss, and the thought of it being a loss makes us feel a certain kind of way. And when we feel a certain kind of way, not wanting to lose or have the feeling of losing, we continue to pull and tug more in this game of tug of war in stressful relationships. But here is a question that I often ask people in therapy and in counseling. Very, very simple question. How do you end a game of tug of war that you are no longer interested in? A lot of people say, pull the opponent or pull the other person past whatever the mark is or whatever the line is. They think that is the way that you end it. And I said, absolutely not. That is not the way you end it. That is the way that you win if you're trying to win. But winning can be, again, a result of what you think about the tug of war. And because of what you think, you feel a certain thing about that. I want to win. And because you want to win, it determines your behavior, which is continuing the game of tug of war. But the way to end the tug of war, to stop the stress, to stop the pulling, to stop the hurting on your hands, is simply let go of the rope. When you let go of the rope, the game's over. So what happens in a situation like that is your cognition changes. What you think about the process, what you think about the stressful relationship, what you think about the tug of war, the game, has to change. When you think differently about it and you understand that there's more damage being caused by playing the game or by being in the stressful relationship, then that will make you feel an obligation or a sense of being obligated to stop the thought of the pain. And when you do have the feeling, then you let go. And the stress is done, it's released, and it's over. So those are three areas that CBT can be used, which are very, very vital. And of course, there's more. There's a lot more that CBT can be used for in everyday life to help people get past certain situations and certain outcomes. For this episode, I am primarily focusing on these three uses of CBT. And primarily these are what I see in my counseling endeavors at Ohio Christian Counseling Ministries, which is the counseling practice that I have where I do counseling. So the three that I see is usually it challenges thoughts that lead to depression and anxiety. That one is a given. That's primarily what it is used for, but it can also be used for having low self-esteem and a less than healthy self-view. That can be changed. There's a way to correct that, because more likely than not, those feelings of low self-esteem and a less than healthy self-view stems from the belief that in some way, shape, or fashion you are not enough, or you may have been made to feel that way somewhere back in your past, that you were you were insignificant, you were unimportant, you were not enough, you were not validated. So because you have those thoughts, that experience, it gives you the thought that I'm not enough, which of course brings about the feeling of low self-esteem, a less than healthy self-view, which again determines how you behave. You become tolerant of things that normal healthy people would not be tolerant of. You become more of a people pleaser because you're trying to validate the pain and hurt that you're feeling inside. You're trying to validate that through actions externally instead of dealing with the issue that may have been taking place internally, which is how you think about yourself. Now, the third and last is basic problem solving in stressful relationships. And of course, we've went over that just a second ago, so I won't go over that again. Now, here's what you have to understand. Everything has a root. Unhealthy emotions, they have a root. If you think a certain thing about yourself, if you have a negative self-perception, if you have negative thoughts, you have to understand that somewhere in your past, somewhere in some experience or set of circumstances, it has taken root. When we deal with unhealthy emotions, they're usually rooted in what we think about a particular situation or event, which brings about a feeling which causes us to behave a certain way. Thought, feeling, action. So that should be something that's easier to remember. For example, if I felt unloved as a child, that will determine how I feel about myself, which will determine how I accept from what I will accept from others and what I allow others to do to me. Right now in this present age, in this present world condition, that in particular is running rampant throughout society, especially Western culture. Negative self-perceptions is what everybody is picking up because the family dynamic is being absolutely brutalized and attacked on so many different levels until a healthy perception and view of oneself coming into adulthood out of your adolescent years, it's very, 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 very low in percentage as far as how many people make this transition from adolescence into, from your early adolescence into your adulthood. Is very few people that come into it with a healthy self-perception. Either it's over-exaggerated or it is less than what it should be. So it is important to understand that this perception comes from it's rooted in certain things in our past. And because we've carried them for so long, because they have been a part of who we are for so long, we become to accept them as norms. These are normal behaviors. These are normal thoughts. These are normal perceptions that I have of myself. The issue with that is it also brings about a abnormal feeling. Even with the thought, I want to make sure everybody understands this. Even with the thought that these perceptions, these feelings, these things, these experiences that I have suggest to me certain issues that I'm perceiving as normal, not because they are, but because they've been with me for so long. So I perceive them as normal. What it does is it creates in us an abnormality. And that abnormality is based on the fact that we don't feel comfortable with that so-called normal train of thought. It's our cognition. It's how we think about ourselves. It is a toxic, a dysfunctional, and an unhealthy pattern of thought about ourselves that is based on or is rooted in some early past experience, and we carry those thoughts through with us, and it gives us a feeling. And even though we have that feeling, right? Even though we have this feeling of which is abnormal, it's contrary to what we know we should be feeling. Even though we have that feeling, there's still the idea that it's normal. And once that happens, that starts the cycle. That starts the process. A cognition that starts the wheel rolling, which of course gives birth to action or brings forth the fruitfulness of actions. And those actions strongly depend on how we feel, and it makes us make choices. It allows us to make choices that are extremely unhealthy in regards to our physical, mental, and spiritual health and our well-being. So what we have to do then. So what is the process? What has to take place for us to get a hold onto this? What has to happen in order for us to kind of switch this stop the momentum of this pattern and of this cycle? Well, the ultimate thing is change the narrative. We all live by a movie that plays in our head, and we are the star of that movie. And most of the time, the script to that movie is written by our past. So what we have to do is recognize and understand that narrative, if it's a negative and unhealthy narrative, that narrative, it can be changed. It absolutely can be changed by changing what we think. Changing what we think about the situation, about the circumstance, about the person, about the self. Once we change the way we think about it, it will ultimately change the way we feel about it. And once we change the way we feel about the situation, the circumstance, the person, the self, then the behavior changes, right? We react differently to the people, the situations, the circumstances, and the self. we become more self-caring, more self-loving. Once we recognize and understand the thing that we're dealing with. Okay, so we change the narrative. So how do we do that? How do we change the narrative? We change the narrative by changing what we think about the event or the circumstance. For instance, if I felt unloved, which creates the feeling of me being undeserving of love. And I want to make sure that you catch that you pay attention to that, because when we're younger and we feel unloved, we don't just, the mind doesn't just take that in as, okay, I was unloved. No, what the mind does is draws a conclusion, and the conclusion that the mind draws is I'm unlovable. So just imagine that. Just imagine that. See, this is the core of all promiscuity. This is the core of all crime. This is the core of all suicide. This is the core of all abuse, alcohol abuse, sexual abuse, drug abuse. This is where most of it is rooted in. It's rooted in the fact that we identify with the thought, right? The thought that we are unlovable. But that is absolutely not the case. Just because we may not have been loved, it does not mean that we are unlovable, especially not when we have to be the ones to get the ball rolling and love ourselves. If we're not going to love ourselves, how can we expect for anybody else to? Okay, I can reconstruct my thoughts that have been given to me, and this is back to changing the narrative. I can reconstruct the thoughts that have been given to me based on circumstance, experience. I can reconstruct those thoughts and make them be something different, which will remove the feeling of me being unworthy, which suggests I have no value and deserve certain treatment, which changes how I allow people to handle me and how I handle myself. So the focus has to become, how do we change this narrative? And we can only change this narrative not externally, not based on sermons, not based on essays, not based on lectures. We change the narrative by changing the pattern, removing the pattern based on how we think. We have to interrupt the pattern. When people come to me for counseling, that is all counseling is from my perspective. All counseling is you come to me with a certain set of patterns that are unhealthy, a certain set of conclusions that you've drawn that are unhealthy or that you can't figure out. And you come to me, and my job then is to disrupt those patterns, is to alter that reality, to reconstruct that train of thought. That is ultimately my job when clients come to me for counseling. So the way that we change it is first change the narrative. We have to change the narrative. And we change the narrative by reconstructing what we think about the incident, what we think about the circumstance, the situation, the experience. If the idea is, well, my mother or father did not love me, therefore I am unlovable, the narrative can be changed. The thought regarding that circumstance can be changed to look extensively at your parents' genetics and your parents' makeup and your parents' issues and suffering and their path, because they have a path and a life that they lived before we came along. And most of the time, when we look at the parents, we may come to the conclusion of an unloved child feels unloved because his parents were at one time unloved themselves. So we can't expect for our parents to give to us something that they never had. So instantaneously, the thought has to change. Once there is a new reality or a new narrative brought into the pattern, then time has to be taken to look at that new narrative, and that new narrative disrupts the cycle that existed previously. Wow, it's not that I'm unlovable. It's that my parents were never in a position or had their own issues, and they were not in a position or able to give to me something that they did not have. That changes what you think about self. That breaks the cycle that was governing you, that interrupts the narrative that has been playing in your head. And you ultimately come to the conclusion that, okay, it's not that I'm unlovable. I am very much lovable. And the number one person who must show that first is myself. So it's easier to love yourself when you recognize and understand that based on your past, you're not unlovable. You just were born into a situation or a set of circumstances that for a long time has suggested one thing to you, but once that pattern is interrupted, you come to the conclusion that it's not that I'm unlovable, it's that they were not able to love me. Completely different things, two completely different things. And based on which one of those two you believe, it determines how you feel. When you feel one way, you can offer compassion instead of resentment, anger, and some disdain that you may have carried towards your parents. You can now look at your parents, or whoever the person may be. It could be someone you dated, could be a coworker, could be a boss, could be anybody, a business partner. You can look at this person with some sense of compassion and understand that, wow, you have a story too. And your story and the way you chose to act from your story, I will not allow it to dictate to me the rest of the chapters in my life. So it is by grace and it is by mercy and it is with compassion that I allow you to have your story while I write my own. And my own written story is, I am not unlovable. I am very much lovable. So again, it is interrupting the pattern that supports bad thoughts and produces bad behavior. There's many areas throughout our life. Now, I want you to get this. There's many areas throughout our life where this type of therapy is needed. It's not just depression. It's not just anxiety. It's also one of the areas that I'd like to really touch on here is in the area of our dating. And right now there is just an overwhelming number of people, because I also offer couples therapy. So there's a overwhelming number of people in today's society who are finding it absolutely impossible to find someone to date who is, or to have a connection with, who is of the same train of thought, who is of the same, who has any moral character and standard by which they are a viable partner to get serious with and date. And I want to shed light on this very quickly. When it comes to CBT and this process, if a person feels as though, and this is the thought that most people have, both men and women, there are no more good men. There are no more good women. I can't find a good man, I can't find a good woman. And because of that thought, now get this, that thought is rooted in some prior bad experience or circumstance. That is why you have the conclusion that there are no more good men or good women, because that thought is rooted in a bad experience. So when you have that thought, then that thought brings about a feeling. Thought, feeling, action. So that brings about a feeling, and that feeling, which is usually associated with that thought, is whenever I meet a person, walls go up. I'm on the defensive. Things have to be proven to me, which there's absolutely nothing wrong with. But when the proving becomes unhealthy to normal interaction, not based on the fact that what stands before you is a person that is so insidious, It is based on the fact that you've had some bad experiences. And because of those bad experiences, you believe that all men or women are bad. And because you believe all men or women are bad, then you feel that you have to conduct yourself this way. Thought, feeling, behavior. So in a sense, we feel justified in the manner in which we handle people who we've just met, that we've never known. We feel justified in the way that we handle them. So I want you to understand that it's not always a self attack. It's not always minimizing of self. It's not always a healthy, unhealthy self view. Sometimes it can be an unhealthy self view of the people around you based on your thought, which gives you a feeling, which makes you put up these walls, which makes you believe everybody's out to get you, right? So again, it works exactly the same way. When we interrupt the pattern that maybe, first and foremost, in this particular situation of dating, first and foremost, there has to be accountability. You were the chooser. Have to be accountable. Once you're accountable, you understand that this person has a history, this person has a past, just like your mother or your coworker or your BFL or whoever. This person has a past. And of course, they were less than accurate at representing what the early connections of love and relationship should be. And because of that, shame on them. But that's not my stuff. They can keep their stuff. That experience that I had with me being the chooser and taking full accountability for it, I ultimately will not let that experience become or write the remaining chapters of my life. And because the pattern is broken, it brings about a different set of feelings. So everybody is not as bad as you thought they were. It just it just means that I have to be a more discerning chooser, right? Because before I wasn't choosing from a healthy place. So I have to be a more discerning chooser. And in being a more discerning chooser, that means I'll get better results. That is 100% the case. We make things a lot more complicated than they actually need to be. But it is so very simple to look at your past in any given avenue, family, relationship, whatever the case may be, to look at your past, find what your narrative or your thought process is rooted in, find a way to disrupt that pattern or that train of thought, which is going to ultimately change the way you feel about that thought or about that pattern, which once you've changed the way you feel, it will absolutely 100% give you a better result. So if nothing else from this episode, here's something that you can take with you. Thought, feeling, action. Whether the thought is good or bad, you're going to get a feeling, good or bad, which is going to reap you a behavior that is going to be good or bad based on the thought. It all starts with you. So again, if you're interested in receiving some therapy of this type, CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, you can reach out to me at Ohio on Facebook at Ohio Christian Counseling Ministries. Or you can give me a call at 513-238-2607. I thank you for joining me again on this episode of the Christian Counseling Talk Show, and I look forward to speaking with you again.